Hi, thanks for coming to my TED Talk today on this mandatory assignment that I have to do and am actually loving. So, my name is McCall Isles. I am a third-year psychology student here at UBC, which has probably been the best decision of my life, and well, let's just get right into it. I based my presentation primarily on Psyc413's unit of what makes us so special, pedagogy, primarily because the breadth of the readings focused on imitation, which I found to be incredibly interesting. All right, that's probably enough introduction for now. Let's get to the meat of it. The question of how pedagogy takes place can be rather ambiguous, as by the time that humans are able to communicate judgment and justification, which is ages 4 and 5, pedagogy has already been taking place. This restriction does keep the intricacies of how we learn veiled to an extent, but not completely. By observing behavior in response to controlled cues in situation, there is a breadth of research that is able to account for how humans, from an early age, develop social inference. For instance, Ligari, Wen, Herman, and Whitehouse were able to, in their 2015 study, establish that children between the ages of 4 and 6 are able to differentiate between conventional and instrumental imitation, displaying an imitative flexibility. In 2009, Corvu and Harris were able to establish the value of the informant when it comes to trusting information, regardless of accuracy. This is true until the ages of 4, and where moderation of trust seems to become malleable. Over in Carpenter, additionally, in 2013, were able to affirm the relationship between imitation and social affiliation, adding another implication to sociocultural transmission. This adds imitation to the list of mimicry, normativity, and group conformity. It is on the basis of these findings that I became interested in the foundations that these studies refer to, specifically that of imitation's implications, normativity, and the reverse side of conformity, that being ostracism. From there, I delved into 3 particular articles, that being first of Over and Carpenter's 2015 study on children infer affiliative and status relations from watching others imitate. The second being Schmidt, Rakowski, and Tomasello's 2011 study of young children attribute normativity to novel actions without pedagogy or normative language. And the third being Watson, Jones, Ligari, and Whitehouse and Clegg's 2014 study, task-specific effects of ostracism on imitative fidelity in early childhood. This last one is actually the one that piqued my interest the most, as I ended up having a couple criticizations of their method. My criticizations actually sparked my research proposal of investigating the effects that ostracism, particular forms of ostracism, going from priming to the cyberball game paradigm, which is a very well used and know-in measure within ostracism study, as well as the effects that physical immediate ostracization has on imitation. Beginning here with imitative reasoning, and I found that the main question asked was, how early are children, specifically ages 4 and 5, because this population is capable of both judgment and justifying their judgments to us, are they able to infer affiliation and hierarchy among groups by observing imitation? There were 2 experiments that both age groups participated in. The first study focused on whether or not children can infer affiliation via imitation. There were 3 models set up. One was to be imitated, the other was to imitate, and the other was neutral. The imitation that they chose to exhibit was either crossing their legs, wearing particular colored scarves, and imitating actions such as picking up a book and looking at the camera. The second study focused more on whether or not children are able to infer hierarchy based on who is being imitated. This study involved 2 models, where one would be imitated and the other would imitate them. Both of these studies, with their models, were recorded in 60-second clips, which were then shown to children who were in classroom and brought out to a specific room where they were to observe and then report as to who they thought were either friends, like in the very first one, who did the woman who's being imitated, who did she like? And in the second one, simply who's boss? In the first experiment, Over and Carpenter predicted that children would most likely infer, or would infer, that the woman who was being imitated was friends with the woman who was imitating her. In the second study, they predicted that children would infer that the model who is imitated is the boss of the imitator, meaning that inferring that someone who's being imitated has more status and that the person who is doing the imitating is of a lower status. Regarding the 5-year-olds, there was actually a significant effect in both experiments. In fact, when it came to justifying why 5-year-olds said what they said in experiment 1, that the imitated liked the imitator rather than the neutral model, 87.1% expressed explicit imitation justification with very limited implicit or no reference to imitation justification. Adjacent to experiment 1, however, in experiment 2, the 5-year-olds, while still showing a significant effect, about 44.4% showed explicit imitation justification, perhaps referencing that there is still development going on in regards to sensitivity towards hierarchies. Regardless of that, 5-year-olds have shown that they are able to infer relative status from imitative behavior. On the flip side of that is the 4-year-olds. This group across both experiments showed an insignificant effect of being able to infer imitation purporting affiliation or hierarchy. This is compounded by the fact that across both experiments, 4-year-olds tended to give largely, in both cases, 69.6% and 76.2% of no referenced imitation in their justification. Interestingly, when it comes to numbers, a chi-square test showed that there was no significant difference between performance of the two ages. However, upon second analysis, they were able to see that when taken into account justifications and whether or not their answers were quote-unquote correct, those who explicitly referenced imitation in their justification were largely significantly more 5-year-olds than 4-year-olds. Truly, this underlines a developmental pattern of how we are able to reference imitation in regards to affiliation and hierarchy. Truly, this underlines a developmental pattern of how we are able to reference imitation in regards to affiliation and hierarchy. To quote the study itself, we now have converging evidence in favor of this claim from 3 different lines of inquiry. First, children use imitation themselves when they seek to affiliate with others. Second, children respond positively to being imitated. Third, as we have shown here, children infer information about affiliation from watching others imitate interactions. When it comes to the development of social inference, perhaps imitation is the next step after inference of dominance and group membership. Now, right off the bat, the title itself both asks and answers its own question, which is, do children attribute normativity to novel actions without verbal normative cues? However, this doesn't apply to all situations. There are 2 particular conditions. The first being the variation of context of the observation. Is this extensive and direct? Meaning, is it what we expect pedagogy to look like, or is it incidental? Would this be happening were the child there or not? And the second condition is that of the perceived intention of the activity, whether it be planned and conventional or normative, or is it spontaneous, that it was just created in that moment. There were 4 conditions within this study, that of ostensive communication and incidental observation. Those are within the context conditions. And the second is of marking of action conditions, being recognizing and inventing. What was being modeled is listed within the 4 condition categories there. A hand puppet was used within the model phase to either sit across from the child or distant from the child, and this puppet would be playing a game that he either knew, and obviously he was handling the objects as though they were familiar to him and conventional, or he would be just kind of flurrying about, making up a game on the spot, and was clearly unfamiliar with the objects he was playing. The study hypothesized that should natural pedagogy be correct, there should be a main effect of the context of observation. If normative language were to be correct, there would be an absence of normative response across all conditions. And if intention symbolism were correct, then manipulation of marking of action would show a main effect in imitation and normative reinforcement. From this, what was measured was both protest within the test phase as well as levels of imitation within the action phase. From the results, it became quite obvious that the main effect was regarding the marking of action condition of recognizing regardless of condition of context. This immediately rather dismisses the natural pedagogy hypothesis that it relies upon incidental observation, meaning the context of communication effect. And what this also underlines is the effect of kind of knowing what you're doing. When someone knows what they're doing and it is evident, this rather portrays a normative, conventional way of doing something. When one is able to infer that the other knows what they're doing, this inference brings upon normative actions and reinforcement. Alongside that is imitation. As we have seen in the previous studies covered, there's a tendency to trust an informant that knows what they're doing and is accurate in what they do. That in itself has been seen to produce high levels of imitation fidelity. And of course it is evident, and this study supports that as well. Lastly, I will discuss briefly Watson, Jones, Ligari, Whitehouse, and Clegg's study on ostracism and its effects on imitative fidelity in early childhood. This is in fact the study that sparked my own research proposal. Similar to the other studies, it did involve 48 5 to 6-year-olds, but as well included 48 3 to 4-year-olds. There's quite an emphasis on imitation when it came to this study, which is in part where my criticization comes from, especially as directly in the title it says ostracization and its impacts on imitation. However, the ostracization priming that they provided was a very short clip. I believe it was 60 seconds of either watching an ostracism condition or an affiliation condition where there were stars going across a screen, and one star would either attempt to join the group and not be allowed in and then eventually go down to the bottom of the screen alone, or in the affiliation condition would same sort of format happening. However, two of the stars were together in either corner. I personally have high doubts that this would be able to produce effective and realistic simulation of ostracism on the imitation fidelity. Regardless, however, within the study, the main hypothesis that within the ostracism convention condition that children will display higher levels of imitative fidelity and provide more social conventional explanations for their behavior was found to be correct. A large amount of those producing social convention responses within that condition was 54%. And the only sort of mirroring effect was within the ostracism instrumental condition, where 54% produced neutral responses. However, I do have some severe questions about their methodology and therefore their results, as if should that form of ostracism priming, be ineffective, then thereby their results would be null. And that is what brought me to my own research proposal, that being the effects of priming and experiencing ostracism in imitation, fidelity, and intensity. My primary questions here were, when studying the impact of ostracization, is priming enough to elicit a significant effect? As well as, to what effect does the experience of ostracism have on one's imitative fidelity and the strength of the imitation? I have proposed two studies here, and both are 3x3 between subjects design with a control in one. What I'm proposing here are two different experiments, although related. Both are 3x3 factorial designs, and both involve the three different age ranges of 4 to 5, 6 to 10, as well as young adults and adults, which would go to about 35, I believe. The first experiment here on the slide is involving just the primary ways of measuring ostracism and its effects on imitation, that being the first one of priming ostracism, similar to the study that we saw with Watson et al., the one I particularly had some criticizations of, simply to see what its effects are, compared to Cyberball, which is an online measure. It's quite popular within the study of ostracism and has actually been proven to be quite effective. The third one would be experiencing peer ostracism, which would be a physical condition involving Confederates, where the Confederates would, by some means, ostracize the participant in question, in order to see what their responses are. After each condition, as is common with most ostracism studies, there would be a video where the participants would watch, and their imitative reactions would be observed. Within the second experiment would be to observe the effects that physical personal ostracism has. The first condition would be pure ostracism, as I discussed there within the first experiment. In the second condition of partial ostracism, the Confederates, except for one, would ostracize the participant, and another Confederate would be ostracized with them. And in the control condition, the participants would not be ostracized and would be included within the primary group, or, as an alternative, these participants would play cyberball. We would be measuring both over-imitation, the extent to which someone imitates that which is unnecessary towards the end goal means or the motor requirements of the action, as well as the intensity and levels of imitation fidelity. My primary hypothesis, which is very general, it's overlapping both of these just simply to save on time, and that is that those experiencing pure ostracism will exhibit higher levels of over-imitation as well as higher levels of imitation fidelity than those in other conditions. A couple notes here to be made is the first concerning ethics of exposing young children to ostracism, especially that of physical personal ostracism as discussed in the second experiment, as well as I would suggest certain study replications, especially this one, as well as Watson et al.'s experiment study I have included in here, as there has been found to be general error in empirical methodology, which there has been difficulty in replicating, specifically within the psychology field. I would also suggest studies such as this outside of weird contexts, that being westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Seeing as children are able to both infer affiliation and hierarchy from imitation, as well as being able to infer and project normative values and behavior upon others, there's the question of what role ostracism has within these contexts. While Watson-Jones et al. Raises the question of the efficacy of priming ostracism and its impacts on imitation, does, however, raise a very interesting area to study, that being the impact that ostracism has on imitation. While researching this particular area, I found it to be incredibly sparse, which is surprising when it comes to psychology, although not surprising when you consider how complex psychology is, I suppose. The only other study that was relevant to ostracization and its effects on imitation was another one by the same name of Watson et al. That particular study was used to create a hypothesis that children use high-fidelity imitation when in response to being ostracized by in-group members. Beyond these two studies, however, there is very little research within this area. And that is what brought me to wondering about the different effects that different forms of ostracism, as well as prompting ostracism, have on imitation. Should a baseline be able to be established of the specific effects that specific types of ostracism, as well as different types of simulating ostracism, have on imitation, there does open the possibility of a more consistent body of research within this field.